They said retirement homes have better care. It's for your safety, Mom. Just a short stay until we figure things out. That's what my daughter told me, standing in my kitchen, with her arms folded tight across her chest, like she was keeping her sympathy from leaking out. But the brochure on the counter wasn't for a retirement home. It was for a psychiatric facility. I didn't realize that until much later, after I'd already agreed, after the papers were already signed, after the door had already locked behind me with a soft, permanent click. I'm 81 now, and I live above a flower shop in a small Vermont town where nobody knows my last name. I keep geraniums on the windowsill and a kettle that whistles too loud. Every morning, I make tea and remind myself that I am free. Not safe, not stable, not supervised, just free. And sometimes that word tastes better than anything else. But back then, I thought I was just being cared for. I thought love still meant trust. I thought family still meant home. It began in the smallest way, as these things always do. My daughter, Helen, started calling more often, but staying on the line less. Her voice was clipped, her questions rehearsed. Are you remembering to take your medication? Have you been sleeping properly? You haven't been leaving the stove on again, have you? The again stung. I had left it on once, 3 months before, when the neighbor stopped by and distracted me with her gossip about the postman's divorce. I'd caught it myself, turned the knob, opened the window, and sat down, shaken but grateful. It wasn't proof of decline. It was proof I still paid attention. But for Helen, it became evidence. One careless flame in her argument that I was slipping. She started visiting with folders and pamphlets, and each visit had less laughter and more paperwork. The first one was about independent living, the next about assisted communities. By the third, she'd switched to what she called transitional options. I didn't realize the transition she meant was from autonomy to invisibility. I remember that morning too well, the way she walked through my door without knocking, followed by her husband Peter, who smelled faintly of aftershave and condescension. They'd brought coffee, the kind I never liked, too bitter and thin. She sat across from me, smoothing the brochure on the table with the edge of her hand, her nails immaculate. You'll love it, she said. They have gardens, art therapy, even book clubs. Peter added, and nurses on call. It's really the best option now that you're living alone. I wanted to laugh, to tell them I'd been living alone for 15 years since their father died, and the only thing I'd lost was patience for other people's fear. But I just nodded, because mothers are trained to make their children feel good about hurting them. They spoke in careful tones, the kind you use when explaining something to a child. They told me the visit would only be temporary, just until they felt reassured I was adjusting. Adjusting to what? They didn't say. I asked if I could bring my books. Helen smiled too quickly. Of course, Mom. Just a few, though. They'll have a library. I asked if there was a phone in the room. Peter said, You'll have everything you need. I should have known then. When people start promising that you'll have everything you need, it's usually because they're about to take something you can't live without. The drive was long, through miles of autumn hills, trees blazing red and gold. I thought we were going to the facility she'd shown me on the brochure. A bright building with wide verandas and residents playing chess in the sun. But when the car turned down a narrow road lined with bare trees, my stomach tightened. The sign at the gate didn't say Sunrise Meadows, as I expected. It said Northridge Behavioral Wellness. The word behavioral lodged in my throat like a splinter. "Is this it?" I asked. Helen didn't answer right away. Peter said, "They've changed the name. Rebranding. Makes it sound more professional." The guard at the gate nodded at him like they'd rehearsed it. I wanted to believe the lie because it was easier than believing the alternative, that my own child had misled me. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and quiet despair. The receptionist wore a cheerful expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome, Mrs. Langley," she said. "We've been expecting you." She handed me a clipboard. I hesitated. Helen stepped forward, her hand light on my shoulder. "Just sign, Mom. It's for insurance." Insurance for what? I didn't ask. My pen trembled as I wrote my name. I wish I could say I signed under duress, but truthfully, I signed out of habit. For 80 years, I had signed everything my family handed me: permission slips, checks, cards, documents. Love, for me, had always involved a signature. They took my purse for safekeeping. They asked me to remove my jewelry to avoid loss. I was shown to a small room with a narrow bed, no locks on the inside, a window that didn't open. Helen kissed my forehead lightly and said, "You'll settle in. We'll visit soon." The words didn't sound like a promise. They sounded like punctuation. Then she left. The door closed behind her with a soft, mechanical hiss. I waited for footsteps to return, but the hallway stayed silent except for the occasional echo of a trolley. I remember sitting on the bed, the smell of bleach and old linens clinging to my sweater, and realizing that for the first time in my life, no one could hear me if I called. That first night, I didn't cry. Crying felt too much like surrender. Instead, I counted the tiles on the ceiling, 48 in all, and listened to the distant murmur of televisions through thin walls. Someone down the hall was singing tunelessly, a lullaby warped by age. Another voice shouted, then quieted under the weight of authority. Every so often, the overhead lights flickered, and the sound of keys rattling reminded me that care, in the wrong hands, can look a lot like captivity. The next morning, a nurse named Brenda came in with a clipboard and a paper cup. "Time for your medication, sweetheart," she said, her voice dipped in sugar. I asked what it was. "Just a mild relaxant," she said. "Doctor's orders." I told her I hadn't seen a doctor. She smiled in that professional way, the kind that means you're not supposed to notice. I set the cup down untouched when she left. Later, I found it replaced with another one, half filled with water. They were testing compliance. I passed by, refusing. At breakfast, we sat in a sterile dining room under a muted television that showed weather reports no one listened to. The other residents stared into their plates or into nothing at all. Some trembled from medication. Others hummed softly to themselves. I tried to start a conversation with the woman beside me, a thin figure with dyed blonde hair and eyes that darted like trapped birds. She said, "They told me I was going to the spa." Then she laughed, a sound both wild and broken. "You at the spa, too?" I shook my head. "Not exactly." When I asked to call my daughter, the nurse said, "Later, dear. We'll schedule it." Later became never. The payphone in the hallway was under maintenance. My watch disappeared during laundry. My reading glasses went for cleaning and didn't return. Without them, the world blurred softly at the edges, and perhaps that was the point, to make it harder to see what was being taken. I realized then how easily a person can vanish, not through death or disappearance, but through redefinition. They called us patients. We had arrived as mothers, teachers, widows, librarians. By the end of the week, we were just names on clipboards, units of compliance, soft voices that no longer contradicted. At night, I would lie awake, trying to reconstruct the day in my mind, like a puzzle with missing pieces. I remembered Helen's face when she left. Calm, efficient, relieved. There was no malice in it, only exhaustion, as if she had just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. I suppose that's what made it worse. Cruelty disguised as duty is the hardest kind to fight because it believes itself righteous. I told myself she didn't know, that she'd been misled, that she thought this place really did have gardens and book clubs. But deep down, I knew she knew. She wanted peace of mind, and peace of mind for her required my silence. It's been 2 years since that day, and sometimes, when I hear the soft hum of the flower shop below, I still think of the sound the doors made when they closed behind me. Airtight, final, like a decision that could not be undone. But I am here now. I can turn the key in my own lock. I can step outside whenever I want. I can buy my own tea and choose the wrong brand if I please. People think freedom for the old is about assistance, about help and safety and rails to hold on to. But real freedom is the right to make your own mistakes. I fought for mine in ways my daughter will never understand, because to her, my mistakes were the enemy. To me, they were proof I was still alive. They said retirement homes have better care. They were right about one thing. Care is powerful. In the right hands, it saves you. In the wrong hands, it erases you. I learned that in a room with no locks, under the watchful eyes of people who called me sweetheart. I don't know what name they wrote on the chart beside my bed. I only know it wasn't mine. The day that sealed it began with the sound of plastic wheels on linoleum, the squeak of a cart pushed by a nurse who moved like she had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. It was my 4th morning inside Northridge, and by then I had learned that the hours moved differently there, slow as syrup until they suddenly weren't. Breakfast had come and gone. I'd managed to trade my untouched medication cup with the woman beside me, a former school teacher who couldn't remember her own age but still corrected grammar in the weekly newsletter. I was sitting by the window in the common room, the one that looked out onto a fenced courtyard, trying to count the birds that landed on the wire. That was when the nurse appeared, clipboard in hand, her name tag slightly crooked. "Mrs. Langley," she said, "you have a visitor." For one irrational moment, I felt something like joy, relief that Helen had come to take me home, to explain that there had been a mistake, that she hadn't meant for me to stay in a place where laughter sounded like therapy and privacy like rebellion. I stood up too quickly, my knees protesting, and followed her down the corridor. The smell of disinfectant clung to everything, even the air between the walls. In the visitor's room, Helen was waiting, impeccably dressed as always, a beige coat folded over the back of her chair, her purse resting on her lap like a shield. She smiled, too brightly, and said, "Hi, Mom." I sat opposite her. Between us was a small table with a vase of artificial flowers that gleamed under fluorescent light. "How are they treating you?" she asked, her voice overly careful, as if she were reading from a manual on how to speak to the unstable. I wanted to tell her the truth, that they treated me like furniture that occasionally asked questions, but I said only, "It's quiet here." She nodded approvingly, taking it as a compliment. Then she leaned forward. "I brought you some things," she said, pulling out a book, a cardigan, and a small tin of butter cookies. I noticed that the book was a devotional I'd never read, and the cardigan wasn't mine. "Thank you," I said anyway, because gratitude had become my only remaining language. After a few minutes of small talk that neither of us believed, I asked, "When can I go home?" She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the nurse standing discreetly by the door. "Let's just focus on getting you comfortable first," she said. "The doctor thinks you need a bit more time to stabilize." "Stabilize," I repeated, the word foreign and heavy in my mouth. "I'm not unstable." She smiled again, the same rehearsed curve of lips that didn't reach her eyes. "I know, Mom, but you've been anxious lately. Forgetting things. You called me twice last week about the same grocery list." "That's because you never answered the first call," I said, but she was already rearranging the flowers on the table, her attention elsewhere. The nurse cleared her throat softly, and I realized the visit was nearly over. "Just trust the process," Helen said as she stood to leave. "They're here to help." Her voice had the finality of a benediction. I wanted to grab her hand, to force her to look at me, to say that I wasn't sick, that I still remembered every word of the lullabies I used to sing to her when her father worked late, that I still knew how to balance a checkbook, bake bread, drive a car. I wanted to remind her of who I was before I became a problem to be solved. But the words wouldn't come. They had been smoothed out of me by days of compliance and silence. When she reached for her purse, I caught a glimpse of a folder inside, the same beige color as the one I had signed when I arrived. A corner of paper peeked out, stamped with my name and the words "Temporary Guardianship." My chest tightened. "Helen?" I said softly. "What is that?" She looked startled, then composed. "Just some insurance paperwork," she said. "You don't have to worry about it." And then she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and the hollow echo of responsibility transferred. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hallway lights never turned fully off, just dimmed to a perpetual twilight that made it impossible to tell the difference between dreams and waking. I lay in bed and tried to remember the sound of my house at night. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboard near the kitchen, the soft rustle of wind through the maple outside my window. Here, the sounds were mechanical and deliberate. The rhythmic squeak of nurses' shoes, the metallic snap of medication trays, the low murmur of televisions playing shows no one watched. Around midnight, I heard sobbing from the next room, a low keening that rose and fell like a wave. I wanted to get up, to comfort whoever it was, but the door to my room was locked from the outside. I stared at the handle until the sobbing stopped. The next morning, a man in a white coat introduced himself as Dr. Preston. He had kind eyes that didn't match his voice. "Mrs. Langley," he said, "we've spoken to your daughter. She's worried about you." "She always worries," I said. "That's her hobby." He smiled politely. "She mentioned some episodes of confusion." "I'm confused about why I'm here," I replied. He ignored the comment and started asking questions. What day it was, who the president was, where I was born. I answered each one correctly, watching his pen hover just long enough to make me doubt myself. When he finished, he said, "Your cognition seems intact, but we'll continue to monitor your mood. Sometimes stress can mimic clarity." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. In this place, even lucidity was treated as a symptom. After he left, Brenda returned with the paper cup. This time, I swallowed it under her watchful gaze, then waited until she turned her back, before slipping my tongue against my cheek and spitting the pill into my napkin. I wrapped it carefully and hid it under the mattress. It became a small act of rebellion, proof that I still owned my will. Days passed in measured repetition, meals, rounds, group sessions where we were told to share our challenges. When it was my turn, I said, "My challenge is being believed." No one laughed. The therapist, a woman with overly symmetrical features, scribbled something on her pad. Later, I found the note clipped to my file. Paranoid tendencies, resistant to care. The moment that truly broke me came the following Friday. I was in the courtyard, sitting under the weak sun, when I saw Helen through the glass doors talking to Dr. Preston. Their silhouettes were distinct, hers upright and impatient, his slouched and conciliatory. He handed her a form to sign, and she hesitated only a second before writing her name. I pressed my hand against the window, but neither of them looked up. When they finished, she turned to leave, slipping her sunglasses on, her hair glinting under the fluorescent lights. She looked like a woman who had just completed something necessary, not cruel. I watched her walk away until she disappeared behind the gate, and something inside me went terribly still. That stillness was the catalyst. Not the betrayal itself, but the recognition of how calm it felt. The realization that I had crossed from disbelief into comprehension. I wasn't here to be helped. I was here to be managed. That night, I wrote on the back of a napkin with a borrowed pen from the cafeteria. They have taken my name and called it care. I folded it and hid it inside the spine of a book someone had left in the common room, a battered copy of The Secret Garden. It felt fitting. A secret inside a secret. I didn't know yet who would find it, only that someone must. Over the next days I wrote more. Notes about the routine, the medications, the way Brenda counted the cups, the number of locked doors between my bed and the exit. Each note became a breadcrumb, a record of existence. Because in a place built to erase you, the act of remembering becomes resistance. The final push came a week later during Family Wellness Hour, when relatives were invited to join residents for group exercises. Helen didn't show. Peter came instead, checking his watch between shallow compliments. During the closing circle, we were asked to share what we were grateful for. When my turn came, I said, "I'm grateful I finally understand what safety means." He smiled awkwardly, not realizing it wasn't gratitude but indictment. When the session ended, he shook my hand like a man sealing a deal, then walked out without a backward glance. I sat there long after everyone had gone, the words "family wellness" echoing in the sterile air like a punchline without laughter. That night, I knew I could no longer wait for someone to rescue me. The people I loved had already decided I needed saving from myself, and no argument from within could reach them. The realization didn't come with anger, but with a strange, almost maternal sadness, the kind you feel when you watch a child repeat a mistake you once made. They thought they were doing the right thing. That was what made it unforgivable. I closed my eyes and pictured my own handwriting, the way my name looked when I wrote it freely. I promised myself I would write it again, somewhere beyond these walls. That promise was the first true act of freedom I'd made in months. The next morning, as Brenda handed me another cup, I smiled sweetly and took it without hesitation. She smiled back, pleased with my compliance. But as she left the room, I whispered under my breath, so softly it barely formed sound, "I'm not staying." And though no one heard me, the words hung there like a seed in the air, waiting for the moment to grow. The third week blurred into something almost dreamlike, though there was no dreaming in that place, only a continuous gray stretch of waking that never quite ended. The clocks on the walls were deliberately slow, or perhaps my mind had adjusted to their rhythm, where hours elongated into corridors and nights dissolved without permission. I had stopped asking for phone calls. The first few times I tried, the nurses smiled politely and said, "Later, dear." Eventually, I stopped giving them the satisfaction of refusal. Instead, I began observing. Observation is a form of survival, something you learn when your voice is no longer trusted. I watched who carried keys, who lingered near the nurse's station, who moved too quietly, and who too loudly. I memorized the shifts. The blonde nurse with the freckles worked mornings. The one with the nervous laugh took nights. And Brenda, the one who called everyone sweetheart, hovered somewhere in between, always appearing when least wanted, always with that same soothing tone that could have been mistaken for kindness by someone who didn't know what it felt like to be gently erased. The building itself began to reveal its geography. The hallways all looked identical at first, but I noticed the small variations. The wallpaper in Wing B had a faint floral pattern that ended abruptly near the fire door. The tiles in the east corridor squeaked underfoot in a rhythm you could follow to avoid being heard. There was one exit I could see from the courtyard, an unassuming metal door marked "Staff Only." Through its small window, I sometimes caught glimpses of the world beyond. Trees, a sliver of blue sky, once even a delivery van with its back doors open. The sight was intoxicating. I had started walking laps around the courtyard under the pretense of exercise, timing how long the nurses allowed me before they ushered me back inside. 12 minutes, then 11, then 10. Control was tightening like a belt. It was around then that a new resident arrived, a woman in her late 60s named Margaret, though the nurses called her Maggie as if renaming her could soften the fact that she didn't want to be there. She came in trembling, clutching a handbag they promptly took from her. Her first night, she cried quietly, and no one comforted her. On the second day, I sat beside her at breakfast. Her eyes were wide, bewildered. "They said this was temporary," she whispered, "just until my medication was adjusted." I nodded. "They all say that." Something in her expression changed, a flicker of recognition, of solidarity. From then on, we sat together at meals, two women bound not by friendship, but by shared captivity. We developed a silent rhythm. When one of us was questioned, the other listened. When one of us faltered, the other steadied. In the afternoons, we were encouraged to attend engagement sessions, a cruel phrase for supervised idleness. They made us paint childish pictures or shape clay into meaningless forms, all under the guise of therapy. I remember pressing my fingers into the wet clay and thinking how strange it felt, like touching something that could remember. I molded a small bird, fragile and clumsy, and hid a scrap of paper inside its hollow center. On it, I had written, "I am not supposed to be here." It was an absurd gesture, but it gave me strength. Margaret saw what I did and followed my lead, carving words into her clay. "Help me." When the instructor saw it, she smiled indulgently and said, "That's very expressive, dear." The clay bird was taken away for firing. I never saw it again. Around that time, they moved me to a different room under the pretext of renovations. The new room was smaller, colder, with a window facing a blank wall instead of the courtyard. It was a calculated disorientation. People forget that deprivation doesn't always mean violence. Sometimes it means silence, white walls, and too much order. My books were misplaced during the transfer. I asked for them repeatedly, and Brenda finally said, "They're being reviewed to make sure they're appropriate. The idea that literature needed to be vetted for safety would have been laughable in another world. Here, it made perfect sense. I began hoarding paper, napkins, meal slips, scraps from the bulletin board. I used a borrowed pencil stub to keep notes, careful to disguise them as doodles. I wrote everything: the time the lights dimmed, the order of rounds, the phrases the nurses repeated when they thought we weren't listening. "You can't help them all," one said to another. "They don't even know what day it is." I did know. It was Thursday, October 12th. I etched the date into the wooden underside of my bed with the metal clasp from a broken hairpin. The act was small but deliberate, an assertion that my life was still being lived, still being counted. Margaret deteriorated quickly. They increased her medication after she refused group therapy. Within days, her speech slurred, her hands trembled, and her eyes lost their brightness. When I asked Brenda what they'd given her, she said, "Just something to help her rest." The phrase "help her rest" became synonymous with sedation. I realized then that compliance wasn't safety. It was surrender. The line between patient and prisoner is thinner than paper when everyone insists it's for your own good. My own treatment shifted subtly. Dr. Preston began shortening our sessions, asking fewer questions, taking more notes. He told me I was making progress, which I understood to mean I was becoming less troublesome. He praised my acceptance, unaware that my calm was strategy, not surrender. The less I resisted, the more they ignored me. And being ignored, I discovered, was the closest thing to freedom one could find in that place. One afternoon, while cleaning my small bedside drawer, I found something that wasn't mine. A crumpled receipt tucked under the lining, dated 2 months before I'd arrived. It was from a cafe in the nearest town, with the signature of one of the orderlies scrawled across it. The total included coffee, a sandwich, and a newspaper. On the back of the receipt, written in neat, looping handwriting, were 3 words: "Check the bins." I didn't know whose handwriting it was, but I understood the message. That night, during the brief window when the hallway lights dimmed for quiet hour, I crept to the utility closet near the staff station. Inside were large plastic bins labeled for recycling. Beneath layers of discarded packaging and plastic wrappers, I found shredded paper, documents, reports, intake forms. Some bore names I recognized: Margaret's, mine, and others. My own file, or what was left of it, contained a photocopy of the form Helen had signed. The words "temporary guardianship" were underlined in red. Beneath it, a handwritten note: "Hold until reassessment. Patient displays resistance and mild paranoia." I remember sitting on the floor of that closet, the fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead, reading the words over and over until they blurred. Mild paranoia. That was how they would explain everything I said, every protest, every attempt to assert reality. It was a perfect system. Deny the captive's credibility, then interpret any objection as proof of illness. There was no way out through reason. I understood that now. I returned to my room and wrote a single sentence on the back of the receipt before hiding it beneath the mattress. They think sanity is silence. It became my mantra. Over the next days, I began preparing for escape. Not the dramatic kind with alarms and broken windows, but the quieter, more dangerous kind that begins in the mind. I began pretending to agree with them, echoing their words back with a docility that made them comfortable. I attended therapy, nodded at platitudes, took my pills in front of them, then excused myself to the bathroom to spit them into the drain. I smiled during group discussions and said, "I feel better now," until they stopped looking at me altogether. The invisibility I once feared became my camouflage. Margaret, poor soul, didn't have the strength for such games. One morning, she was gone. When I asked where she'd gone, Brenda said she'd been transferred to a facility better suited to her needs. The phrase chilled me. It was the same phrase they'd used about a man who'd vanished the week before. I began keeping track of disappearances. 1 every 10 days, sometimes 8. They called them transfers. I called them erasures. Then something unexpected happened. During the librarian's weekly visit, a soft-spoken woman with gray hair and kind eyes, I saw a familiar shape among the donated books she carried in her cart. It was The Secret Garden, the same title I'd hidden my first note inside. I picked it up, heart pounding, and flipped through the pages. The napkin was gone, but in its place, tucked discreetly between chapters, was a torn piece of lined paper. On it were 5 words in pencil. "You are not invisible anymore." I looked up sharply, but the librarian had already moved on to another table. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. That night, lying in the dark, I thought about those words. Someone had found my message and understood it. Perhaps they were still here. Perhaps they'd left and managed to reach beyond these walls. Either way, the line had been thrown. I just had to hold on. The next morning, when the routine began again, the pills, the check-ins, the hollow reassurances, I felt different. Beneath the surface of obedience, something alive was stirring. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape, becoming sharper, more useful. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was waiting. Waiting for the smallest chance. A loose latch, an unlocked door, a sympathetic glance. Anything that would let me step, even for a moment, back into the world that had decided I no longer belonged to it. They had taken my freedom, my name, my dignity, but they hadn't yet taken my patience. And in a place like that, patience was the most dangerous weapon of all. The first true shift came quietly, without warning, the way a door sometimes opens, not because someone turns the handle, but because air pressure changes on the other side. By then, I had stopped counting the days, though I knew winter had started outside. The few trees visible beyond the fence had lost their leaves, and a thin layer of frost glistened on the courtyard benches each morning. The fluorescent lights inside Northridge hummed, as if in competition with silence, and the endless routine had flattened every hour into sameness. I was no longer being watched as closely because I had perfected the performance of serenity, and serenity, I learned, was rewarded with neglect. I smiled when they expected it. I nodded at the doctor's empty questions, and when Brenda handed me the little paper cup, I let her see me swallow while the pill hid neatly beneath my tongue. There is an art to appearing compliant. I became its most patient student. It was during one of those long afternoons, when most of the residents dozed in front of the television, that the volunteer librarian appeared again, pushing her metal cart filled with books that smelled faintly of dust and life. Her name was Evelyn, and she always wore a cardigan that seemed to shed tiny bits of wool wherever she went. She recognized me at once. "You liked The Secret Garden, didn't you?" she said, and her eyes lingered on me for a second longer than politeness required. I nodded carefully. She placed a new book in front of me. Jane Eyre. Its spine cracked, its pages annotated by someone who had once cared deeply about words. Inside the front cover, in faint pencil, was a small note. "Keep writing." My pulse quickened. When I looked up again, Evelyn was already moving away, pretending to straighten a stack of magazines. That night, I sat on my bed, turning the book over in my hands, and felt something I hadn't felt since before the hospital. Possibility. The phrase, "keep writing," wasn't just encouragement. It was instruction, a continuation of a conversation begun in whispers. I waited until lights out, then tore a blank page from the back and began scribbling with the pencil stub I kept hidden in my sleeve. I wrote everything: the routines, the names of staff, the hours the gates opened for deliveries, the exact model of the lock on the courtyard door. I wrote about Margaret, about the van that came for her in the middle of the night, about the way her room was emptied before morning as though she had never existed. Writing steadied me. The more I recorded, the less invisible I became to myself. In that small act, I reclaimed authorship of my own story. The next week, Evelyn came again. She moved slowly down the hallway, speaking softly to the residents, her voice a lullaby of normalcy. When she reached me, she smiled, the kind of smile that isn't for show. She lowered her voice and said, "If you ever have something that needs to go out with the books, you can slip it between the pages. I check everyone before they leave." Then, as if realizing she had said too much, she added briskly, "You should try the Brontes. They're good for the soul." I nodded, pretending to study the cover. After she left, I sat for a long time with my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of choice. Trust, after betrayal, feels like a dangerous luxury. But the message had been clear. Someone outside these walls knew, or at least suspected, what this place truly was. I began writing a letter that night. Not to Helen. I no longer wrote to her in my mind. She belonged to another world now, one built on polished surfaces and self-justification. Instead, I addressed it to an old friend, Samuel Avery, who had once lived 2 houses down from me. He had been a lawyer before retiring, a man who believed that words on paper still had power. We had lost touch after my husband died, but I remembered his kindness, his patience when explaining legal forms to me years ago. I wrote to him about the facility, about the locked doors, about how the staff used medical jargon to disguise restraint as care. I wrote carefully, precisely, without emotion, because emotion is what they would call instability. At the end, I wrote, "Please verify the nature of my guardianship. I never consented to permanent placement." I signed my full name, underlined twice, as if the ink itself could remind me who I was. The next morning, when Evelyn came with her cart, I slipped the folded letter between the pages of Jane Eyre. She took it without a word, but her eyes flickered briefly with recognition. I spent the next week in a state of quiet tension, waiting for something, an announcement, a reprimand, a sign that my letter had been intercepted. Nothing came. Life continued in its sterile rhythm. For a time, I wondered if I had imagined the entire exchange, if my desperate hope had invented a conspiracy of kindness. But 2 weeks later, during our so-called wellness group, Dr. Preston was interrupted mid-sentence by a nurse who handed him a note. His expression shifted, only slightly, but I saw it. Surprise first, then irritation, then the quick composure of a man who has practiced pretending. After the session, he called me into his office. "Mrs. Langley," he began, his tone both condescending and cautious, "I understand you've been writing letters." I kept my face neutral. "Just reflections," I said. "Therapeutic, as you advised." He studied me for a long moment. "There's no need to reach outside for validation," he said finally. Your daughter has full authority over your care. You're safe here." "Authority isn't the same as consent," I replied before I could stop myself. His pen paused over his notebook. "You seem agitated," he said. "Perhaps we should revisit your dosage." The threat was implicit, and I felt my throat tighten. I forced a smile. "I only meant that I appreciate the help." He nodded slowly, his suspicion easing. When I left the office, my knees trembled, but my mind was clear. If he knew about the letter, it meant it had reached someone. Perhaps Samuel had already begun to act. The possibility was enough to keep me steady. A few days later, something changed in the atmosphere of the ward. The staff grew tense, their voices lower, their smiles thinner. There were whispers about an inspection, though no one told us anything directly. For the first time, the nurses began tidying corners that had been ignored for months. The air smelled sharply of bleach. One evening, I overheard Brenda complaining near the supply closet. "They're sending someone from the state." Some busybody lawyer filed a complaint. My heart lurched. I knew then that my letter had reached its mark, but relief was quickly followed by fear. Exposure could make them dangerous. That night, as I lay awake listening to the usual creaks and hums, I thought about what would happen if the inspection failed to uncover the truth. I could be transferred, like Margaret. My notes, my small archive of evidence, could be destroyed. I got up quietly, my bare feet cold against the tile, and retrieved the hidden papers from beneath the mattress. I needed a safer place. Moving through the hallway, I slipped into the recreation room, where a dusty piano sat unused in the corner. I lifted the lid and tucked the folded pages beneath the strings, then lowered it carefully. The sound it made was soft and final, like the closing of a secret. The next morning, Evelyn came early. She moved briskly, avoiding eye contact with the nurses. When she reached me, she whispered, "Your friend received your letter. He's contacting the board." My throat constricted. "How do you know?" I asked. "He sent word through the library office," she said. "He's persistent. You chose well." Then, before I could thank her, she was gone. For the first time in months, I felt my breath deepen. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was proof that the world beyond these walls still knew my name. That afternoon, I looked at my reflection in the small metal mirror above the sink. The light was unflattering, the surface warped, but the woman staring back at me looked undeniably alive. "You're still here," I whispered to her. "Don't let them make you forget." 2 days later, the inspection team arrived. We were gathered in the dining hall, pretending to enjoy lunch, when 3 strangers in suits appeared, escorted by the director. They smiled too widely, their pens poised like weapons. We were told they were consultants. The staff hovered, anxious. When one of the inspectors stopped by my table and asked how long I'd been a resident, I answered calmly, "Too long to still be called a visitor." His brow furrowed slightly before he moved on. By evening, the building buzzed with tension. The administrators were furious. Someone had tipped the inspectors off about irregularities. I kept my expression blank, my heart steady. That night, Brenda entered my room without knocking. She looked tired, her usual false cheer gone. "You shouldn't have written to anyone," she said softly. "It makes things harder." "For whom?" I asked. "For everyone," she replied, almost pleading. "They'll make changes, and none of them good." I realized then that even among the staff there were prisoners of a kind. She hesitated before leaving, her voice barely audible. If someone asks, you tell them you're happy here. Do you understand? I nodded, but my silence was not consent. It was strategy. The following morning, the inspectors returned. There were closed-door meetings, raised voices, a flurry of papers exchanged. By the end of the day, something in the staff's demeanor shifted. Brenda avoided my eyes. Dr. Preston's office door stayed shut. Late that evening, Evelyn appeared once more, her face pale but resolute. "You'll be contacted soon," she whispered. "Stay calm. Don't antagonize them." Then she slipped away before anyone could see. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, feeling both terror and anticipation coil inside me. Freedom was no longer an abstract dream, but a tangible, precarious possibility. I thought of Helen, of the soft certainty with which she'd signed those papers, and wondered if she'd feel relief or fury when she discovered her mother had disobeyed. It didn't matter. The act itself had already changed me. I was no longer the woman who waited for permission. I had moved, however slightly, from victim to participant. When dawn broke, pale light filtering through the narrow window, I rose from the bed and stood by the door. The air smelled faintly of coffee and bleach, of endings disguised as beginnings. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked. Footsteps approached. I didn't know what would happen next, whether the system would crush my effort or whether it would crack under the pressure, but I knew that whatever followed, I had already crossed a threshold inside myself. I was no longer waiting to be saved. I had started saving myself. The news of the inspection spread through the facility like a rumor that no one was supposed to hear, yet everyone instinctively knew was true. It changed the air, made it denser, as if even the walls were listening more carefully. For a few days after the inspector's visit, the staff tried to maintain the illusion of calm efficiency, but their voices grew sharper, their smiles thinner, their patience shorter. The hallways seemed narrower, the light more artificial, and the routine, so stable, so calculated, began to show cracks. I could feel it in the way Brenda avoided my eyes when she handed me my medication, or how Dr. Preston's once endless sessions were suddenly reduced to brief, perfunctory check-ins. Whatever had happened during those meetings behind closed doors, it had unsettled them deeply. And yet, no one said a word to us. To the residents, silence remained the official language of care. Then, a week later, Helen appeared again, unannounced. It was the first time I'd seen her since the day she brought me there. Though I had replayed that moment so many times it had become an echo that never stopped reverberating. She looked immaculate as always, her beige coat buttoned high, her hair pulled back neatly, her face pale from lack of sleep or guilt. I couldn't tell which. When I was called to the visitor's room, my pulse quickened. For a brief moment, the old instinct of hope flared, the one that refuses to die no matter how many times it's betrayed. But as soon as I saw her standing beside Dr. Preston, clutching a folder to her chest, I knew this wasn't a reunion. It was an interrogation disguised as concern. "Mom?" she began softly, her voice trembling with practiced sympathy. "We need to talk." She gestured for me to sit. I obeyed, keeping my expression neutral. Dr. Preston remained standing behind her, his arms crossed. She opened the folder and slid a few papers across the table. "These are reports," she said, "from the staff. They say you've been acting differently." I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. "Differently from what?" I asked. "From before," she said. "You've been writing letters, avoiding medication, questioning procedures. They're concerned you're under a lot of stress." I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table so she could see they weren't shaking. Stress doesn't make people prisoners, I said. It makes them human. Helen's eyes flickered toward Dr. Preston, seeking reassurance, perhaps permission to continue. He nodded slightly. "Mom," she said, her tone shifting to one of patient condescension, "we know how hard this transition has been, but these people are trying to help you. When you resist, it only prolongs your treatment." "Treatment for what?" I asked. "For being inconvenient?" The words slipped out sharper than I intended. Her mouth tightened. "You've been confused," she said. "You've been imagining things, inspections, conspiracies, people watching you." I smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile that felt like a small rebellion. "Those inspectors were real, Helen. You should have seen them. Maybe you would have recognized what this place really is." Her face changed. Something brittle cracked behind her composure. "You don't understand," she said. "After Dad died, you weren't the same. You were fragile. I tried to help, but you pushed me away. You wouldn't let me in. So you locked me out of my own life," I said quietly. "That's one way of getting in." She shook her head, her voice rising slightly. "I did what was necessary. You were forgetting things. You could have hurt yourself." "Forgetting things," I repeated slowly. "Like whose signature is on that guardianship form?" She flinched, but recovered quickly. "You signed it," she said. "You just don't remember." It was such a perfect lie that for a heartbeat, even I doubted myself. But then I remembered the way she had placed her hand over mine that day, pressing the pen into my fingers while the papers were already half filled. It hadn't been consent. It had been choreography. Dr. Preston cleared his throat. "Mrs. Langley," he said smoothly, "we're only concerned for your well-being. These accusations of misconduct, of confinement, are very serious. You wouldn't want to cause unnecessary trouble." "Trouble," I said, meeting his gaze. "Is that what you call the truth here?" His eyes narrowed. "The truth," he said, "is subjective when it comes to mental health." The arrogance in his tone ignited something inside me that had been smoldering quietly for months. "The truth," I said, "is that you built a system that depends on obedience, and when someone questions it, you call it illness. The truth is, you're more afraid of being seen than I am of being silenced." Helen stood abruptly, her voice trembling now, not with sympathy, but with anger. "That's enough," she said. "I came here because I still care. Don't make me regret it." "You already should," I replied. She gathered her things, muttering something to Dr. Preston about adjusting medication. As she turned to leave, she paused, her hand resting on the door handle. "You've always been dramatic, Mom," she said. "You've always needed someone to blame." I wanted to tell her she was right. There was someone to blame, but I also knew she would never see it that way. To her, this was mercy, not betrayal. When the door closed behind her, I felt the world tilt slightly, the air shift, as if some invisible tether between us had finally snapped. After that visit, things worsened. My privileges were revoked. No courtyard walks, no books, no group sessions. They called it temporary observation, but it felt like punishment. My meals were brought to my room, my door locked for longer stretches. The isolation was deliberate, a message. They could take even silence away if I tried to fill it with meaning. The other residents noticed my absence, though few dared to ask. When I did see them, briefly in the hallway or during monitored exercises, their eyes avoided mine, not from cruelty, but fear. Margaret's empty bed was reminder enough of what happened to those who resisted too loudly. One evening, during rounds, Brenda entered my room with an expression that tried to be gentle. "Helen called," she said. "She's worried. She wants to increase your dosage just for a while." I looked at her and said, "Do you ever listen to yourself? You sound like a prison warden reading bedtime stories." Her face tightened. "You're making things harder," she said. "You could leave sooner if you just cooperated." "Leave where?" I asked. "You mean transfer me like Margaret?" The name slipped out before I could stop it. Her eyes darted to the door. "You shouldn't say her name," she whispered. "Why not?" I asked. "She existed, didn't she?" Brenda hesitated, her expression flickering with something almost like guilt. "You don't understand," she said. "We don't decide these things." Then she turned and left, the door clicking softly behind her. That night, I dreamed. Not the hazy, disjointed kind of dream brought by sedatives, but something vivid and coherent. I was back in my old house, standing in the kitchen, where sunlight spilled across the table. Helen was a child again, her hair in braids, asking me to tie her shoe. I bent down, my fingers trembling slightly, and when I looked up, her face had changed into Dr. Preston's. He smiled and said, "You signed it, remember?" I woke with my heart pounding, the taste of fear and bitterness sharp in my mouth. The dreams stayed with me, not as hallucination, but as metaphor. They wanted me to forget who I had been so that they could control who I became. But I wasn't gone yet. The next morning, Evelyn didn't come. Her absence was like a hole in the air. I asked one of the nurses where she was, and she shrugged. Volunteers come and go. But something in her tone was off. Too practiced. Too final. Later that day, I overheard two orderlies whispering near the laundry room. One said, "That librarian woman? They told her she wasn't needed anymore. Too many questions." My chest went cold. Evelyn had been my one connection to the outside world, my fragile thread of hope. Now that thread had been cut. The following days blurred into each other. The staff grew more watchful again, as if preparing for something. My door was left unlocked for the first time in days, a gesture that felt less like kindness and more like bait. I walked the corridors carefully, noticing new locks on some doors, new residents replacing the vanished ones. The courtyard was closed for repairs. The television in the common room played static instead of news. Control had tightened into paranoia. The institution was protecting itself. Then, one afternoon, a familiar sound interrupted the monotony. The distant rumble of an engine outside, the squeak of wheels on gravel, the clang of gates. I went to my window and saw a van parked near the entrance. Two men unloading boxes marked medical supplies. But the boxes were too large, too heavy, and the men's movements too rehearsed. I recognized the van's logo. It was the same company name printed on the clipboard the night Margaret was taken away. The realization struck like a physical blow. They were preparing another transfer. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. If they decided I was too troublesome, I could vanish like the others. That night, I didn't sleep. I wrote feverishly on whatever scraps of paper I could find. Napkins, envelopes, the backs of old schedules, recording everything I knew, every date, every name, every pattern of disappearance. I hid the pages in multiple places, under floorboards, behind the radiator, inside the hollow leg of a chair. The act of writing was no longer just resistance. It was insurance. If I disappeared, my words would remain. 2 days later, they came for me. It was early morning. Brenda entered with two orderlies and said softly, Mrs. Langley, we're moving you to another wing. The doctor believes you'll be more comfortable there. I forced myself to stay calm. Comfortable, I said. Like Margaret? She winced, but said nothing. They escorted me down a hallway I had never seen before. Narrower, colder, with barred windows. I realized this was the isolation wing used for residents deemed uncooperative. The room they placed me in was stark. White walls, a single bed, a camera high in the corner. No books, no personal items, not even a clock. I spent hours pacing, trying to control the rising panic. At some point, I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened and Dr. Preston entered, clipboard in hand. "This is temporary," he said. "We just need to reassess your condition." "Condition," I repeated. "You mean resistance?" He ignored the jab. "Your daughter agrees this is best. You'll thank us later." "You keep using that word. Later," I said. "But later never comes here, does it?" He frowned. "You're agitated again. I'll adjust your medication." I smiled faintly. "You do that." When he left, I sat on the bed and stared at the camera until its tiny red light blinked off, either by accident or choice. That evening, something unexpected happened. The lock clicked, and the door opened quietly. A young nurse stepped inside, a face I hadn't seen before. She looked barely 20, her eyes darting nervously toward the corridor. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered. "Neither should you," she replied, her voice trembling. "They told me to check the monitors, but I read your notes." My breath caught. "You found them?" She nodded. "Not all. Enough. You were right about the transfers. They move people under false names. I saw the paperwork." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. She hesitated. "Because my grandmother was in a place like this. No one listened. I couldn't save her. Maybe I can save you." She slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand. "Hide this," she said. "Someone's coming for you soon. Not the doctor, someone else." Then she left as silently as she had come. When she was gone, I unfolded the paper. It was a printed email chain, the top message addressed to the State Health Board, signed by Samuel Avery. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Evidence received. Investigation reopened. Immediate review authorized. It wasn't over. There was a chance. Slim, dangerous, but real. I hid the note under the mattress just as footsteps echoed down the hall. For the next 48 hours, tension built like a storm. The staff moved with forced calm, their eyes darting to the cameras, their voices low. I could feel the institution trembling, its polished facade starting to crack. On the third night, alarms sounded, briefly, then stopped. I heard shouting from the main hall, doors opening, the thud of hurried footsteps. Someone yelled, "They're here!" My heart raced. Moments later, the lock on my door clicked again, and light flooded in. It was Brenda. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "They've got a warrant," she said. "Inspectors, police, everyone. You have to stay calm. Don't say anything until they ask." She hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry." She stepped aside, and behind her stood a woman in a beige coat holding a clipboard. Evelyn, alive, furious, no longer a librarian, but a witness. Behind her, 2 uniformed officers entered. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Evelyn said softly, "Mrs. Langley, you're coming with us." I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady but my spine straight. "I told them," I whispered. "I told them I wasn't supposed to be here." And for the first time in months, the door didn't close behind me. It opened outward, to air that smelled of rain, to voices that didn't speak in euphemisms, to a world that though colder than I remembered, was finally real again. They did not sweep me out into a soft focus ending with apologies and lilies. They brought me first to a folding chair in a municipal conference room that smelled faintly of dust and coffee, where a paralegal with a tidy braid slid papers toward me and asked if I was ready to swear. I said I was, and I was surprised at how steady my voice sounded, as if the days of being spoken over had tuned it to a lower, braver register. The officers waited by the door, neither protective nor skeptical, simply present. And Evelyn sat beside me with her hands folded in her lap, like a woman at church who has already decided that whatever is spoken from the pulpit will be met with the full weight of her attention. The affidavit was longer than I expected, and more ordinary, too. Lines and boxes and places for dates that would anchor what had felt like a fever into the sober arithmetic of time. I signed my name, my full name, not the pet names that had been used to smooth me into compliance, and I initialed every page, and with each curve of ink, I felt the mechanism that had held me begin to come apart, not with drama, but like an engine running out of fuel, sputtering, failing, stopping. They asked if I wanted to press charges, and I said I wanted to press the truth into the record, which is the only charge that sticks when people have become expert at laundering harm through paperwork. The young assistant attorney who met us, cheeks flushed, tie slightly crooked, explained that guardianship can be a scalpel or a cudgel, that emergency orders are often granted in a fog of fear and convenience, that unwinding them requires patience and precision. He spoke in careful sentences, and I could tell he had prepared them for me, but I appreciated the effort, because a prepared sentence is still a kind of respect, and respect had become my hunger. He set a petition to terminate the temporary guardianship on the table, and he asked if I would name a healthcare proxy of my choosing, and I said I would name no one for the moment, because my breath belonged to me, and I would keep it in my own chest until I decided whose hands might hold it without squeezing. There was a hearing, of course there was, because systems love their rituals, and if you survive them, you can sometimes convert ritual into remedy. We sat in a small courtroom whose tired wood paneling had known every shade of human excuse, and the judge, a woman with hair like steel wool and eyes that never quite blinked, read from a stack of papers while I kept my palms pressed flat to my knees to quiet the tremor that came not from fear, but from a body relearning the right to take up space. Helen arrived late with a lawyer in a navy suit who kept touching his cufflinks as if reassurance could be mined from metal. She did not look at me at first. Then she did, and the look was not outrage or grief but calculation, and that hurt in a way I will not dress up with language. When it was my turn to speak, I did not accuse her of malice, because malice would have absolved her. I described the corridor and the paper cups and the vanished residents and the way the doors closed with that soft decision, and I described my own mind as I had found it each morning, intact and insulted, and I asked the court to treat my signature not as a reflex, but as an instrument I could still play. Evelyn testified in the modest voice of women who do not confuse truth with performance, and the young nurse, the one whose grandmother had been erased elsewhere, appeared in a plain skirt and shoes that had not been designed for courage but carried it anyway, and she said what she had seen in the records no one thought she'd read, and she handed over copies of transfer logs that turned people into line items, and for a moment the courtroom felt like a scale that might, for once, register the correct weight of things. Dr. Preston's affidavit was a marvel of hedging. He had written that I exhibited resistance suggestive of underlying anxiety, that I benefited from structured oversight, that the facility could not confirm nor deny certain allegations due to privacy considerations, and reading those phrases aloud in the courtroom made them sound like moths beating themselves against glass. When the judge asked him if he had ever witnessed me disoriented, he said I had asked what day it was, and I said from my chair that it was because the clocks in Northridge told a lie, and the judge smiled with her eyes and wrote something down. The ruling came quickly, not because my story was singular, but because it was familiar. Temporary guardianship revoked, no basis for continued placement, the court admonishing counsel for failing to ensure informed consent, directives for the state board to audit the facility's transfer protocols, and the words sounded like dry timber snapping. Irreversible is a dramatic word, but there are decisions that once spoken into the ledger cannot be unspoken without evidence of miracle, and bureaucracies are poor soil for miracles. We left the courtroom through a side door. The hallway smelled of toner and hand sanitizer, and somewhere behind us, voices rose, then flattened, then resumed their professional pitch, and I realized how much harm depends on tone and how a flat voice can be as sharp as any instrument. There were practical steps, each one small and stinging. We went back to Northridge with 2 officers and a warrant to collect my belongings, and the administrator tried to hand me a bag of someone else's sweaters, and I said evenly that my books had my name on the inside cover in blue ink from a pen I bought at Whitman's Stationery on a Tuesday, because it was the day the clerk with the laugh worked, and if they had any intention of respecting the law, they would return to me the words I had brought with me. They found most of them, not all. Absence now has a different taste, less like hunger and more like scar tissue you can push with your tongue. We photographed the room, the camera in the corner, the window that opened half an inch, the piano with its secret belly empty now because I had emptied it first. And in that act, documenting, printing, labeling, I felt power reconstitute itself not as dominance, but as record. And record is the one thing the future cannot easily forgive. I closed the bank account Helen had been helping with and opened a new one at a credit union where a teller with chipped purple polish did not ask me if I was sure. She asked me what name I wanted on the card, and I said my own. And she said, "Good," as if we had agreed on the weather. I retained Samuel formally with a retainer that seemed both too large and too small for the work of turning harm into pages that walked, and he filed a civil action that did not promise money so much as it promised a transcript, and transcripts outlive reputations, and I have learned to invest in what outlives. We sent a letter by certified mail to Helen, not an invitation to reconcile, not a performance of magnanimity, simply a notice. Guardianship dissolved, power of attorney revoked, all medical decisions mine until I name otherwise, all contact to occur by letter for the time being, and a paragraph at the end that stated with the clarity of a bell that any further attempt to place me without consent would be treated as fraud. I did not ask her why. I did not tell her I forgave her. Forgiveness without repentance is a door left unlocked out of habit, and I am learning the geometry of keys. The newspaper called because that is what newspapers do when officials have to say the word investigation out loud, and I agreed to speak if they would quote me precisely and if they would print the names of the laws that had been bent to the point of obscenity. The reporter was younger than my granddaughter would be if she were the visiting kind, and she held her recorder like a fragile bird, and she asked careful questions. And when she asked if I had a message for families, I said yes. Tell them that concern is not a license, and that paperwork does not convert fear into virtue, and that if they are bringing their mother somewhere for her own good and the doors lock behind her, they should ask themselves whose good that lock serves. I moved into the room above the flower shop because the florist had a sign that said vacancy in handwriting that did not apologize, and the stairs creaked like an honest house, and the window gave me a square of sky that changed, which is all I wanted. Change that answered to weather not whim. On my first morning there, I bought a cheap kettle with a chipped spout, because perfection has become suspect to me, and I bought a small lock for the door and turned it slowly and listened to the bolt slide home with a sound that rewired the word security back into my language. I chose a doctor whose waiting room held real magazines and whose intake form did not ask who spoke for me. And when the nurse asked for my emergency contact, I wrote, "To be determined by me," and she nodded as if such sentences were still permitted. I went to the library and got a card under my name, and Evelyn met me at the desk with an expression that tried not to be proud and failed, and she slid a book across the counter with a small conspiratorial tap, and inside the cover she had written not a message, just the date, because dates are messages enough. The last act of reclamation was the quietest and perhaps the most final. I sat at the small table by the window with a sheet of thick paper, the kind that takes ink like skin takes sun, and I wrote a letter to the state board not as a plaintiff or a witness, but as a citizen who had re-entered the geography of her own life. I listed the names of the women I had known within those walls, first names only because the institution had a way of stealing the rest, and I asked that their files be audited, not for vengeance, but for the arithmetic of accountability. I sealed the envelope and pressed my thumb into the flap where the glue was damp, leaving a print as proof that the body that signs is the body that breathes. Then I wrote a smaller note to myself and taped it inside the cupboard where the cups live. You are competent, and in case the future tries to bargain with you using love, remember that love without listening is only theater, and you did not survive to audition. Irreversibility can be as simple as a signature, as complicated as a soul deciding to refuse its own erasure. And on the day the court order arrived by certified mail, with its embossed seal and its bureaucratic poetry, I placed it in a folder labeled with my name and the word now. I opened the window as far as it would go, which in this apartment is all the way, and I let the cold air move through the curtains and over my hands, and I stood there long enough for my tea to cool, and I did not rush, because urgency had been their instrument, and time had become mine. Outside, a delivery truck backed up with a patient beeping, and somewhere a child shouted, and somewhere someone hammered wood into the shape of shelter, and the sounds braided themselves into a music that did not ask permission to be heard. I did not call Helen. I did not rehearse apologies I did not owe. I turned the key of my own door from the inside and felt the bolt set, and in that small, definite sound, I heard the whole of the climax. Not escape, not spectacle, not triumph in the gaudy sense, but the plain, legal, ordinary miracle of ownership returning to the body it left and staying. I am learning the quiet rituals of freedom again, the small gestures that used to belong so completely to habit that I never noticed their holiness. The turning of a key, the choosing of a cup, the decision to open or close a window, not because someone says the temperature will make me ill, but because I want to feel the air on my face. Each morning, I rise before the street below fully wakes. The florist already setting out her buckets of chrysanthemums. The air thick with the faint sweetness of stems cut at an angle. I boil water, listen for that whistle that once startled me into panic when I still associated sudden sounds with supervision, and pour tea into the chipped blue mug that has outlived 3 kitchens and 1 marriage. On the sill sit the geraniums, stubborn, red, a little wild in their angles. They lean toward the light the way I lean now toward possibility. The days pass, not with the false order of a facility's schedule, but with the natural disorder of weather. I have learned that peace is not the absence of chaos, but the right to meet chaos on one's own terms. There are still moments when the air tightens, when the creak of pipes in the wall sounds too much like the metallic sigh of locks, when the phone rings and my throat closes before memory catches up to reason. I keep the court papers in the drawer nearest to my chair, not as a shield, but as a reminder that truth can be documented, that sanity can be proven, on letterhead. Sometimes I unfold them, tracing my name in its official ink, and I think how strange it is that the same motion of a pen once condemned me and later released me. The world depends on handwriting more than it admits. People think tyranny always arrives with noise, but often it comes with forms in triplicate and polite signatures. I know that now, and knowing is a kind of armor. I hear from Samuel once a week. He sends brief updates written with the meticulous calm of someone who believes in the slow justice of bureaucracy. The investigation is ongoing, he says, which is the bureaucrat's version of confession. Evelyn visits too, sometimes bringing a book, sometimes nothing but conversation. We talk about ordinary things, the weather, the price of milk, the way time folds differently when you're no longer watched. She tells me that some of the staff from Northridge have begun to speak anonymously to the press, that names are surfacing, that there will be hearings. I listen, grateful, but detached. I have learned to measure hope in teaspoons now, not buckets. It spills less that way. Helen has written twice. The first letter was full of explanations written in the defensive rhythm of someone arguing a case to herself. She said she had been misled, that the doctors assured her it was temporary, that she only wanted what was safe. She did not apologize, only circled the word love so often it lost its meaning. The second letter was shorter, a single paragraph asking if we could meet. I have not answered yet. Forgiveness, I have realized, is not an act of generosity, but of sovereignty. It should never be hurried. I do not know whether I will see her again, but if I do, it will not be as a supplicant begging for recognition. It will be as a witness reminding her that love, when stripped of listening, becomes management, and that management, no matter how prettily dressed, is cruelty in bureaucratic clothing. I will decide when that conversation happens. The decision itself is the point. In the evenings, I walk to the library before closing time, the sky bruised purple, the town lights flickering on one by one. The librarian, no longer Evelyn, she has retired, always nods when I enter, as if greeting a fellow survivor of some unnamed catastrophe. I wander through the aisles without urgency, touching spines, reading random first sentences. Once I found a new copy of Jane Eyre and smiled at the coincidence. I opened it, half expecting a note, but there was none, only the scent of fresh paper and the weight of endurance. Sometimes, sitting by the window with a book, I catch my reflection in the glass and see a woman who looks older than the one I remember, but also more precise, like a story that has finally learned its own punctuation. People sometimes ask, gently, if I am lonely. I tell them loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. Loneliness is a wound. Solitude is a choice. After Northridge, silence no longer frightens me. It belongs to me now. I fill it with thought, with music from the radio, with the sound of the florist downstairs dragging her buckets across the floor. I have even started to write again, not the frantic scrawl of survival, but slow letters to the women I knew in that place, though most of them will never read them. I write them anyway, because writing names into existence keeps them from being lost twice. Each letter ends the same way. You are remembered. You were not mad. They were afraid of your clarity. On my table there is always a small stack of envelopes, each sealed, each addressed to no one in particular. One of them holds the story I have written these past months, the record of everything that was done and undone. I will leave it with the librarian when it is finished, to file wherever lost things are kept. Maybe someone will read it one day and recognize their own captivity in it. Maybe some daughter will hesitate before signing her mother's name. That is enough for me. Sometimes I think about the phrase they used, better care. It comes back to me in odd moments, like a line from a song you once danced to and later realized was about betrayal. Better care, they said, as if care were measurable, as if safety were a commodity you could purchase by surrendering another's will. But the older I get, the more I believe that the only true care is attention, the kind that looks, listens, and waits. No brochure can promise that. I wonder if Helen will ever understand, if she will one day sit in her own quiet kitchen and realize what kind of inheritance she tried to give me. Maybe then she will write again. Maybe then I will answer. For now, I wake each morning to the scent of flowers and the whistle of the kettle and the thin light cutting through the curtains, and I breathe without permission. I have no illusions about justice. It moves too slowly and forgets too quickly. But dignity, once reclaimed, does not leave so easily. It sits beside me at breakfast. It follows me into sleep. It speaks in the measured calm of my own voice when I read aloud the words I've written. If you, whoever you are, ever find yourself in a place where love has become a lock and concern has turned to confinement, remember this: the body can be restrained, but the mind is a migrant thing. Keep a fragment of paper hidden somewhere, inside a book, under a mattress, within the hollow of a word, and write your name on it every day until the world remembers how to pronounce it. Do not give up your name. Do not give up the sound of your own refusal. That sound, even whispered, even only to yourself, can open more doors than any key. When I go to bed at night, I leave the window cracked just enough to hear the wind. It moves through the geraniums, rattles the frame, and sometimes I imagine it carries the voices of the women who never walked out. I tell them that I did, that I am still walking, that I am writing, that I have not forgotten. And then, in the dark, I whisper to whoever might need it, the only prayer I still believe in: they were wrong about you. You are still here. You are still yours.